Okay, here's where we are. Mr. A and Mr. B deciding whether or not to steal from each other. If they both do not steal, each will get 100. Not steal, not steal. Each will get 100. If Mr. B steals from Mr. A, Mr. B will wind up with 130. Mr. A will wind up with 50. If Mr. A steals from Mr. B will wind up with 50. Mr. A will wind up with 130. Now, what if they steal from each other? Well, it's going to look something like this. Both players will have the same outcome. That is, they will start with their 100 they're able to produce. There's 100 that they are able to produce. Plus the 50 that they stole from the other guy, which is 150. Minus the 20 it cost them to steal for 130. Minus the 50 that the other guy stole from him, 80. So as you can see, that if each player steals from each other, each will wind up with 80. 80, 80. Now the question arises, what will be the equilibrium outcome? What will these two guys wind up doing? Notice here that both do not steal from each other. That is the most desirable outcome. That will maximize the GDP of this two-person society, 200, and each will be pretty well off, 100 apiece. The worst possible outcome is this, where both guys steal from each other. They both get 80. The GDP of the island there is 160. Here it's 180, and there it's 180, 160. So here's the worst possible outcome. Guess which the equilibrium outcome is going to be in this prisoner's dilemma game? You're right, the worst possible one. Let's see why. Both Mr. A and Mr. B are trying to maximize their own self-interest, which is only natural among human beings. Mr. B is going to say, should I steal? Should I steal or should I not steal? Suppose, and this is what's going through Mr. B's mind, suppose Mr. A steals. So we're looking at that column there, this column here. Suppose Mr. A steals. Will Mr. B be better off by stealing or not stealing? Mr. B will be better off by stealing. On the other hand, suppose that Mr. A does not steal. Will Mr. B be better off then by stealing or not stealing? Clearly stealing. So as you can see, irrespective of what Mr. A does, Mr. B finds it in his self-interest to steal. 80, 130, beats 50 and 100 respectively. So we say that Mr. B has a dominant strategy. That's the strategy he's going to adopt, in this case stealing, the strategy he's going to adopt irrespective of the strategy employed by Mr. A. So that's Mr. B's dominant strategy. As you might guess, Mr. A is going to wind up with the same thing. Let's see why. Mr. A has to decide whether they're going to steal or not steal. So Mr. A says, well, what if Mr. B decides to steal? Mr. B decides to steal. Will Mr. A, be better off by stealing? Remember, Mr. A gets the stuff above the line. Stealing or not stealing? You can see that Mr. A will be better off by stealing. Or, if Mr. B decides to not steal, will Mr. A be better off by stealing or by not stealing? Mr. A will be better off by stealing. So, irrespective of the strategy employed by Mr. B, Mr. A is going to steal. This is his dominant strategy. Notice that both guys have a dominant strategy to steal. The result is the worst possible outcome, 80-80. Even though if they both decided not to steal, they would get 100 and 100. That's the better outcome. So both have the incentive to cooperate, but they will wind up stealing, competing with each other. Suppose one night that they bump into each other and they realize that each is trying to steal from the other guy. And so one of them takes the other by the arm and draws with a stick in the sand, draws this payoff matrix and says, look, don't you realize that we would both be better off if we agreed not to steal? The other guy says, well, you know what? I see that's the case. Let's you and I make an agreement not to steal. We'll make an agreement. They shake on it, and that's their agreement. And as a result, they move here to not steal, not steal. But as time goes on, I got to tell you, you see that 130 there? That's looking awfully tempting to Mr. B. Actually, that's going to go to Mr. A. Sorry. That 130 right there is going to look awfully tempting to Mr. A. You see that 130 there? That's going to look awfully tempting to Mr. B. Mr. B is going to get that 130 by stealing. Mr. A is going to get that 130 by stealing. So, their self-interest, they both go after the 130s, they both wind up stealing, and they both wind up right back here at 80-80. As you can see, they needed to communicate with each other, which they did. They needed an agreement, which they did, but they also needed some way of enforcing the agreement, which they did not have, which caused them to wind right back up here at the worst possible outcome, 80-80. Now, when we talk about oligopoly, you will see that there will be a game theory model, and the game theory that will be analyzed is the prisoner's dilemma game. So the next videos will actually be on economics, in particular the model that is called oligopoly.